The conference room fell silent as Margaret Hayes set down the Mont Blanc pen, the one David had given her on their 5th anniversary. Her hands trembled as she stared at her signature on the divorce papers, the ink still wet, blurring slightly where a tear had fallen. "It's done," the lawyer said, gathering the documents with practiced efficiency. David wouldn't even look at her. His mother Eleanor sat beside him, and for just a moment, Margaret saw the hint of a smile at the corner of Eleanor's lips. A victorious smile. Margaret stood, her cheap heels clicking against the marble floor. She'd worn the Target dress on purpose. Let them see what they thought they'd reduced her to. "I'm sure you'll land on your feet, dear," Eleanor said, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "You're a resourceful girl." The way she said girl made it sound like an insult. Margaret walked toward the door. She didn't look back. What Eleanor Whitmore didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Margaret's signature had just started a timer. 5 minutes. That's all the time they had left before their world collapsed. But Margaret didn't know that in exactly 3 minutes, something would go terribly wrong. Hey everyone, before we see what happens next, drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. And if you love stories where the underdog wins, smash that subscribe button because you're not going to see this ending coming. Trust me. 6 months earlier, David had come home late from his mother's estate in the Hamptons. Margaret had been in their Tribeca penthouse kitchen, going over financial reports for her consulting business. She'd looked up when he walked in, and immediately knew something was wrong. His face was pale, his jaw set in that way it got when Eleanor had been talking to him. "We need to talk," he'd said. "For words. That's all it took to end 7 years. I want a divorce." Margaret had felt the room tilt. "What? David, what are you?" "My family thinks it's best." He still wouldn't look at her, just stared at a spot on the wall above her head. "Mother has concerns about compatibility." Compatibility. Margaret had stood, her chair scraping against the hardwood floor. "David, we've been married for 7 years. What are you talking about?" "She thinks we're too different. Different backgrounds, different goals." And there it was, the thing they'd been dancing around since their wedding day. Margaret, daughter of a single mother who'd cleaned houses to pay for Margaret's state college tuition, wasn't suitable for a Whitmore. Never would be. "This is your mother talking," Margaret had said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Not you. Tell me this is Eleanor talking." For just a moment, David's face had softened. For just a moment, she'd seen the man she'd married. The one who'd pursued her relentlessly at Columbia, who'd promised her they'd build something amazing together. Then his phone had buzzed. He'd glanced at it, probably a text from Eleanor, and his face had gone cold again. "I've already spoken to an attorney," he'd said. "Patricia Thornton. She'll be in touch with your lawyer about the details." Patricia Thornton, the most ruthless divorce attorney in Manhattan. The one who'd gotten a Goldman Sachs executive's wife reduced to practically nothing in a settlement that had shocked even the tabloids. Margaret had known then that this wasn't just a divorce. It was a declaration of war. What she didn't know was that Eleanor had been planning this for over a year. And the real reason had nothing to do with compatibility. The months that followed were brutal in ways Margaret hadn't thought possible. Patricia Thornton had moved like a shark through bloody water. Within 2 weeks, Margaret had been frozen out of joint bank accounts. Within a month, she'd been served with a restraining order barring her from their Hamptons house. The one Eleanor had insisted they buy, though Margaret had paid for half of it. Within 2 months, whispered rumors had started circulating at Manhattan society events. Margaret had been unstable, possibly unfaithful, definitely a gold digger who'd trapped poor David Whitmore. Margaret had sat in the modest Brooklyn office of Daniel Rodriguez, the attorney she'd hired because he was all she could afford once the accounts were frozen. "They're claiming you brought nothing to the marriage," Daniel had said, reviewing Patricia's filing. "That the prenup is clear. 500,000 and that's it." "I helped save David's family firm," Margaret had protested. 3 years ago, Whitmore and Associates was losing clients left and right. "I spent 6 months, unpaid, developing an algorithm that revolutionized their investment strategy." "Can you prove you developed it?" That's when Margaret had paused. Could she prove it? The work had been done on David's computers, using Whitmore and Associates resources. She'd never thought to protect herself because she'd been protecting him. Protecting them. I have my notes, she'd said slowly. My early drafts. But the final version. They'll claim it was a marital asset developed with company resources, Daniel had said. Listen, Margaret, I'm going to be straight with you. Patricia Thornton is going to destroy you in court. We could fight this, spend years litigating, and you'll spend everything you have just to maybe end up with the same settlement they're offering now. So I should just take the $500,000 and walk away? Daniel had leaned back in his chair, studying her. I'm going to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer. Do you want justice, or do you want revenge? What's the difference? Justice is what the court gives you. Revenge is what you take for yourself. He'd pulled out a legal pad. If you want justice, we take the settlement. If you want revenge, we need to be very, very smart about this. Margaret had thought about Eleanor's smug face, about David's refusal to even fight for their marriage, about 7 years of being made to feel less than, of being tolerated rather than embraced by a family who'd never thought she was good enough. I want them to regret this, she'd said quietly. I want them to understand what they threw away. Daniel had smiled for the first time. Then we're going to need to make them think they've won. Can you do that? Can you play weak? Margaret hadn't known it then, but that conversation had set everything in motion. And the plan they developed would require her to become someone she'd never been before. A woman with nothing left to lose. But there was something Margaret wasn't telling Daniel. Something she'd discovered 3 weeks earlier that changed everything. It had started with an accident. Margaret had been locked out of most of her files when the accounts were frozen, but she still had access to one old email account. A Gmail she'd set up years ago for her consulting business. She'd been scrolling through old messages, looking for anything that might help her case, when she'd found it. An email from 3 years ago, from David's IT director at Whitmore and Associates. Margaret, per your request, administrative access has been granted to the following systems, followed by a list of servers, databases, and network architectures. She'd forgotten about that email. When she'd rebuilt Whitmore and Associates' entire digital infrastructure, she'd needed admin access to do the work, and nobody had ever revoked it. Margaret had stared at that email for a long time. Then, hands shaking, she'd opened a secure browser and entered the credentials. They still worked. For 3 years, she'd had complete access to every file, every email, every transaction at Whitmore and Associates. And she'd never once thought to use it because she'd trusted her husband. She'd trusted his family. What a fool she'd been. Margaret had started reading. First, just to understand what was happening with the divorce, to see if there were emails about her. But what she'd found was so much worse than that. Offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. Shell corporations with names like Bayshore Consulting and Maritime Investment Holdings. Money being moved in complicated patterns designed to hide it from the IRS. And emails, dozens of emails between Eleanor and David discussing how to structure the schemes, how to hide the transactions, how to make everything look legitimate. They were committing tax fraud. Had been for at least 5 years. Margaret had sat back from her computer, her mind racing. This was criminal. This was federal prison. This was leverage. But she'd needed to be smart about it. If she went to the authorities immediately, David and Eleanor would know she'd accessed the systems. They'd claim she'd hacked them, that the evidence was obtained illegally. She needed to document everything carefully, legally, in a way that would be admissible in court. So Margaret had started making copies. Every transaction, every email, every piece of evidence. She'd worked late into the night, night after night, building an ironclad case. And she'd kept her mouth shut about all of it. Even to Daniel. What Margaret didn't realize was that Eleanor had noticed something was wrong. And Eleanor Whitmore didn't get where she was by ignoring her instincts. 6 weeks earlier, Margaret had been in her studio apartment in Brooklyn. A tiny space that was all she could afford now, when her phone had rung. A number she didn't recognize. Hello. Margaret, dear. It's Eleanor. Margaret's blood had run cold. Eleanor hadn't spoken to her directly in 4 months. "What do you want?" "So hostile. I was calling to see how you're holding up. I know this has been difficult for you." Eleanor's voice had been syrupy sweet, which meant she was at her most dangerous. "I wanted you to know that there are no hard feelings on our end. This is just business, you understand. Nothing personal. You destroyed my marriage and my reputation. That feels pretty personal." "Oh, Margaret." Eleanor had actually laughed. "Your marriage was already over. You were never right for David. Surely you see that now? You come from such a different world. It was bound to fail eventually." Margaret had gripped the phone tighter, forcing herself to stay calm. "Was there a point to this call?" "Actually, yes. I wanted to make you an offer. If you agree to sign the divorce papers next week without any fuss, I'm prepared to add an additional $200,000 to your settlement. $700,000 total. That's quite generous for someone in your position." $700,000. More than Margaret had ever imagined having. Enough to restart her life, rebuild her business, move on. It was also a trap. "Why?" Margaret had asked. "Why would you offer me more money?" "Because I'm not a monster, dear. I know you've been struggling. I saw your little apartment, David mentioned it. And I thought, well, perhaps we can end this amicably. You take the money, sign a very comprehensive non-disclosure agreement, and we all move on with our lives." There it was. The NDA. Eleanor wanted to make sure Margaret could never talk about the Whitmore family. Never tell anyone about how she'd been treated. Never tell anyone what she knew about the offshore accounts. That's when Margaret had realized. Eleanor suspected something. Maybe she didn't know exactly what Margaret had found, but she was worried enough to pay extra money to keep her quiet, which meant Margaret was on the right track. "I'll think about it," Margaret had said. "Don't think too long, dear. The offer expires in 24 hours. Eleanor had hung up, and Margaret had immediately called Daniel. "She's scared," Daniel had said after Margaret explained the call. "She wouldn't be offering more money unless she thought you had something on them." "Should I take it? 700,000 is a lot of money." "That depends. Do you have something on them?" Margaret had hesitated. This was the moment. Tell Daniel everything, or keep playing it close to the vest. "Yes," she'd said finally. "I have something big. But I need more time to make sure it's airtight." "How much time?" 6 weeks. "I need 6 weeks." Daniel had been quiet for a long moment. "Okay, here's what we do. You decline Eleanor's offer. Tell her you want to think about it longer. That'll make her more nervous. Nervous people make mistakes. And while she's making mistakes, you finalize whatever you're working on. Can you do that?" "Yes." "Margaret." Daniel's voice had been serious. "Whatever you're planning, make sure it's legal. I can't help you if you break the law." "It's legal," Margaret had assured him. "I promise." She'd hung up and gotten back to work. 6 weeks. She had 6 weeks to build a case that would bring down the entire Whitmore family. What she didn't know was that Eleanor had already made a phone call of her own, and that call would change everything. 4 weeks earlier, Margaret's consulting business had been on the verge of landing its biggest contract ever. Colossus Industries, a Fortune 500 tech company, had been courting her for months. They wanted a complete overhaul of their digital infrastructure. A $20 million contract that would establish Hayes Digital Solutions as a major player in the industry. Margaret had been preparing for the final pitch when she'd gotten the call. "Ms. Hayes, this is Jennifer Park from Colossus Industries. I'm afraid I have some unfortunate news. We've decided to go in a different direction for the infrastructure project." Margaret's heart had sunk. "May I ask why?" "I thought our proposal was exactly what you were looking for." There had been a long pause. "Between you and me, Ms. Hayes, we got a call from someone very well connected in the New York business community. They raised some concerns about your stability, your judgment. Given that this is such a large project, we felt we couldn't take the risk." "Eleanor." It had to be Eleanor. "I see," Margaret had said, keeping her voice professional even though she wanted to scream. "Thank you for letting me know." She'd hung up and sat in her tiny apartment, staring at the wall. Eleanor wasn't just trying to win the divorce. She was trying to destroy Margaret's entire life. Make sure she had nothing to fall back on, no way to rebuild. That's when Margaret had stopped feeling guilty about what she was planning. She'd opened her laptop and sent an email to Rebecca Torres at the Manhattan District Attorney's Office. Subject line: Evidence of financial crimes at Whitmore and Associates. The meeting had been set for 2 days later, and Margaret had brought 1,200 pages of documentation. Rebecca Torres had been a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s who'd built her career prosecuting white-collar crime. She'd listened to Margaret's story without interruption, then spent 3 hours reviewing the evidence. "This is solid," she'd said finally. "This is really solid. Shell corporations, offshore accounts, fraudulent tax filings. Ms. Hayes, you're looking at multiple federal charges here. Tax evasion, wire fraud, possibly money laundering. What happens now? Now, we need to verify everything independently. We can't just take your word for it, even with all this documentation. We'll need to subpoena records, interview witnesses, build our own case. That takes time." "How much time?" "Weeks. Maybe a month." Margaret had done the math in her head. "My divorce is being finalized in 4 weeks. Rebecca had looked at her carefully. "Are you trying to use this as leverage in your divorce?" "No," Margaret had said honestly. "Whether I get 500,000 or 5 million, it doesn't matter anymore. I want them to face consequences for what they've done. I want justice. Then we'll move as quickly as we can. But Ms. Hayes, you need to understand something. Once we start this investigation, there's no going back. These people will know you're the one who turned them in. They'll come after you with everything they have. They're already destroying my life," Margaret had said. "At least this way I'm fighting back." Rebecca had nodded and stood up. "We'll be in touch. And Ms. Hayes, thank you for bringing this forward. A lot of people in your position would have just taken the money and walked away." Margaret had left the DA's office feeling lighter than she had in months. The wheels were in motion. Justice was coming. But Eleanor Whitmore hadn't built an empire by being stupid. And she was about to make one final move that would put everything at risk. Margaret had been leaving her Brooklyn apartment when a black Mercedes had pulled up beside her. The back window had rolled down, and Eleanor Whitmore had looked out at her. "Get in, Margaret. We need to talk. I have nothing to say to you. Get in the car, or I'll make sure you never work in this city again. I've already blacklisted you from Colossus. Don't think I can't do worse." Margaret had felt ice run down her spine, but she'd gotten in the car. Eleanor had taken her to a coffee shop in Manhattan. Ironically, one of the ones Margaret and David had frequented when they were dating. They'd sat at a corner table, and Eleanor had ordered for both of them as if Margaret were a child who couldn't make her own decisions. "I'm going to be very direct with you," Eleanor had said once the coffee arrived. "I know you're planning something. I don't know what exactly, but I know you're not just rolling over the way you've been pretending to." Margaret had kept her face neutral. "I don't know what you're talking about. Please. I've been dealing with people like you my entire life. People who think they're clever, who think they can outmaneuver someone like me." Eleanor had leaned forward. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to sign those divorce papers next week. You're going to take your $500,000. And you're going to disappear from our lives forever. And if I don't?" Eleanor's smile had been cold. "I've been doing some research into your past. Your mother was quite ill before she died. Wasn't she? Multiple sclerosis. Very expensive treatment. And yet somehow all those medical bills got paid. I wonder where that money came from." Margaret had felt her blood run cold. "What are you implying?" "I'm not implying anything. I'm stating facts. Your mother's medical expenses were over $400,000 in her final 3 years. Your salary at the time was barely $60,000 a year. Either you're very good at saving money, or—" Eleanor had paused meaningfully. "Perhaps you had access to funds that weren't entirely yours." "I never stole anything." "Perhaps not. But I have friends at the IRS. Friends who would be very interested to know that you declared $50,000 in consulting income the year your mother died. Consulting for whom, I wonder? The records are so vague. Almost as if you were hiding something." It had been a bluff. Margaret had done freelance consulting work that year, completely legitimate. But Eleanor was threatening to bury her in an investigation that would cost thousands in legal fees to defend, even if Margaret was innocent. "You're threatening me," Margaret had said quietly. "I'm protecting my family. There's a difference." Eleanor had stood. "Sign the papers, Margaret. Take the money. Walk away. Because if you try to fight us, I will bury you so deep that no one will ever find you. Do we understand each other?" Margaret had looked up at this woman who'd made her life hell for 7 years. This woman who'd never thought she was good enough, who'd poisoned David against her, who was now threatening to destroy her mother's memory. And Margaret had smiled. "I understand you perfectly," she'd said. Eleanor had looked satisfied. She'd left cash on the table for the coffee and walked out, leaving Margaret sitting alone. That's when Margaret had known she'd won. Because Eleanor wouldn't be threatening her unless she was truly scared. Unless she knew something was coming but couldn't figure out what. Margaret had pulled out her phone and texted Daniel. "Conference room next week. Let's end this." But what Margaret didn't know was that Eleanor had one more card to play, and it would almost destroy everything. Margaret had arrived at Patricia Thornton's office building exactly on time. She dressed carefully that morning. A cheap Target dress, minimal makeup, flat shoes from Payless. She'd looked at herself in the mirror and barely recognized the woman staring back. Where was the confident consultant who'd built a business from nothing? Where was the Columbia graduate who'd graduated top of her class? She'd transformed herself into what they expected. A broken woman ready to accept defeat. The elevator ride to the 40th floor had felt like it took hours. Margaret's heart had been pounding. Everything depended on the next hour. If the timing was off even by a few minutes, if the DA hadn't moved quickly enough, if Eleanor had somehow found out, no, she couldn't think like that. She had to trust that justice would come. The receptionist had looked at her with barely concealed contempt. "Mrs. Whitmore, they're waiting for you in conference room A." Margaret had walked down the hallway slowly, her cheap shoes squeaking on the marble floor. She'd passed offices with mahogany doors and brass nameplates. This whole building screamed money and power, the kind Margaret would never have no matter how hard she worked. Or so they thought. Conference room A had been exactly what she'd expected. Massive windows overlooking Central Park, a table that could seat 20 people, art on the walls that probably cost more than her entire year's salary. David had been sitting at one end of the table, his mother beside him like a queen holding court. Patricia Thornton had stood at the head with documents spread before her like trophies of war. Daniel Rodriguez had sat alone on the other side, and Margaret had seen something in his eyes, nervousness. He'd known what she was planning, but he hadn't known all of it. She'd kept some things to herself just in case. "Margaret," Patricia had begun, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "I'm so glad you could make it. I know this must be incredibly difficult for you. Why don't we sit down and get through this as quickly as possible?" Margaret had taken her seat beside Daniel. She'd kept her eyes down, her shoulders slumped. The performance of her life. "The terms are quite straightforward," Patricia had continued, clearly in a hurry to get this over with. "You'll receive a one-time payment of $500,000. Very generous, considering the circumstances and the prenuptial agreement you signed. In exchange, you'll relinquish all claims to marital property, including the Tribeca apartment, the house in the Hamptons, the Martha's Vineyard property, and any interest in Whitmore and Associates. You'll also agree to a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement regarding your marriage and the reasons for its dissolution." Margaret had looked up slowly, letting her eyes well with tears. $500,000? That's it. It's more than fair, Eleanor had interjected, her voice sharp as a knife. "Especially considering you brought nothing to this marriage except—" She'd paused, glancing at Patricia as if remembering they were in a legal setting. "Especially considering the terms of the prenuptial agreement." David had shifted uncomfortably. "Mother, maybe we don't need to." "David." Eleanor's voice had been cold. "We discussed this." And that had been the moment Margaret had realized David was just as much Eleanor's victim as she was. He'd been controlled and manipulated his entire life, molded into the son Eleanor wanted rather than the man he could have been. For just a second, she'd felt sorry for him. Then she'd remembered the 6 months of hell he'd put her through, and the sympathy had evaporated. The prenuptial agreement is very clear, Patricia had continued, tapping the document in front of her. And given that there are no children from the marriage and the marriage lasted less than 10 years, this settlement is actually quite generous. Many wives in your position leave with far less. Your position, as if Margaret were some kind of charity case. As if she hadn't built a successful business, hadn't helped save the Whitmore family fortune, hadn't been anything more than a gold digger who got lucky. What about my business? Margaret had asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Hayes Digital Solutions? Patricia had shuffled through papers with practiced efficiency. According to our analysis, your business is currently valued at approximately $2 million. However, since you founded it before the marriage, it remains your separate property. You'll retain full ownership. Of course they'd had it valued. Of course Eleanor had made sure to know exactly what Margaret was worth. Probably to confirm it wasn't enough to matter. Wasn't enough to threaten their precious family legacy. And the algorithm? Margaret had pressed, her hands trembling on the table. The investment analysis algorithm I developed for Whitmore and Associates 3 years ago? Patricia and Eleanor had exchanged a glance. A quick, knowing look that told Margaret everything she needed to know about their true intentions. That's an excellent question, Patricia had said smoothly. The algorithm was developed during your marriage using Whitmore and Associates resources and infrastructure. Therefore, it's considered a marital asset that belongs to the company. Since you were never formally employed by Whitmore and Associates and didn't file for any patents or separate intellectual property protection, you have no independent claim to it. There it was. The real reason for this divorce. They'd gotten what they needed from her. The algorithm that had saved their failing company and was now generating millions in profits. And now they were cutting her loose before she could claim any credit or compensation. Margaret had felt real tears burn her eyes. Because despite all her planning, despite knowing this moment was coming, it still hurt. 7 years of her life, reduced to a footnote in a settlement agreement. 7 years of trying to prove herself worthy to people who'd never see her as anything more than an outsider. I see, Margaret had whispered. Daniel had leaned over, his voice urgent in her ear. Margaret, you don't have to do this. We can fight. We can. I'm tired of fighting, Margaret had said. And that part hadn't been an act. She was tired. Tired of being made to feel small, tired of justifying her existence to people who'd made up their minds about her years ago. Eleanor had actually stood up then, smoothing her Chanel suit with satisfaction. I think we're all ready to move forward, then. Margaret, I know this is painful, but you're young. You'll recover. Perhaps you'll find someone more suitable to your background. Someone who understands where you come from. That had been the moment. The exact moment when Margaret had felt something inside her snap. Not anger, not rage, something colder, something more focused. She'd reached for the Mont Blanc pen, the one David had given her on their 5th anniversary, back when he'd still been capable of thinking for himself. Her hand had trembled as she'd positioned it over the signature line. Margaret, Daniel had said one more time, his voice low, please think about this. But Margaret had been done thinking. She'd been planning this moment for months, and now it was time. She'd signed her name in a shaky hand. Margaret Hayes Whitmore. A tear had fallen onto the paper, smudging the ink. Excellent, Patricia had said, quickly gathering the documents before Margaret could change her mind. That's everything. The funds will be transferred to your account within 3 business days. If there's nothing else. Actually, Eleanor had interrupted, standing and walking to the window with her back to Margaret. I think this calls for a small celebration. Patricia, would you open that bottle of champagne your firm sent over? I think we could all use a drink. Margaret had felt sick. They were going to celebrate. Right here, right in front of her. Celebrate the destruction of her marriage, the theft of her work, the end of 7 years of her life. She'd stood on unsteady legs and walked toward the door. Each step had felt like wading through mud. Behind her, She could hear Eleanor already discussing plans for David's engagement party to Vanessa Ashford. Early spring, I think, Eleanor had been saying. Maybe at the plaza. Vanessa's father can invite all the right people from Washington. Margaret's hand had reached the doorknob. Her fingers had closed around it. She'd taken a breath, ready to leave, ready to let them have their moment of victory. And then, Patricia's phone had rung. The sound had cut through the room like a knife. Patricia had frowned at the screen, then answered. Hello? Yes, this is she. What? When? Eleanor had turned from the window, annoyed at the interruption. Patricia, we're in the middle of. Patricia had held up one hand, her face going pale as she listened. I understand. Yes. Yes. I'll inform them immediately. She'd hung up slowly, and Margaret had watched the color drain completely from Patricia's face. What is it? Eleanor had demanded. That was Jonathan Fitzgerald from Whitmore and Associates. There's an emergency board meeting happening right now. And Patricia had swallowed hard. The SEC has frozen all company accounts pending a federal investigation. The room had gone absolutely silent. Margaret had still been standing at the door, her hand on the knob. She hadn't moved, hadn't breathed. David's phone had buzzed, then buzzed again. He'd pulled it out with shaking hands and stared at the screen. There are dozens of emails. From the board, from our clients, from... His face had gone gray. Mother, what's happening? Eleanor had stood frozen for a moment, and Margaret had seen something she'd never seen before. Fear in Eleanor Whitmore's eyes. Then Eleanor's phone had rung. She'd answered it, her voice sharp. What? That's impossible. On what grounds? She'd listened, and with each passing second, her face had grown paler. I want every attorney we have on this immediately. Do you understand me? Every single one. She'd hung up and turned to Margaret, and in that moment, all the aristocratic composure had cracked, revealing the ruthless woman underneath. What did you do? Eleanor had hissed. Margaret had turned around slowly. The broken, defeated woman who'd signed those papers just minutes ago was gone. She'd stood straighter. Her eyes had cleared. When she'd spoken, her voice had been steady, calm, and absolutely certain. I did exactly what you taught me to do, Eleanor. I protected myself. What are you talking about? David had stood, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. Margaret, what's going on? But Margaret hadn't been looking at David. She'd been looking at Eleanor, and she'd seen the moment when Eleanor had truly understood. The offshore accounts, Eleanor had whispered. Every single one, Margaret had confirmed. The Cayman Island shells, the fake consulting companies, the wire transfers designed to hide income from the IRS. I have documentation for all of it. Patricia had stepped forward. That's impossible. You don't have access to. Remember 3 years ago when your firm was collapsing? Margaret had interrupted, her voice growing stronger. When you were hemorrhaging clients because your investment strategies hadn't been updated since the Clinton administration. When you came to me, your son's wife, and begged me to help. David had sunk back into his chair, understanding dawning on his face. I rebuilt everything. Every server, every database, every system in that company. And when I did it, I needed administrative access. Your IT department granted it. They signed off on it. It's all documented in emails and work orders. Margaret had pulled out her phone and begun scrolling. What nobody bothered to do was revoke that access after I finished. Sloppy security, really. I would have expected better from a firm handling billions in investments. Eleanor's hands had clenched into fists. You were spying on us. I was watching my husband's family business. I watched for 3 years as you moved money through shell corporations. I documented every fake loss, every inflated expense, every fraudulent wire transfer. I kept hoping you'd stop, Eleanor. I kept hoping David would notice what you were doing and put a stop to it. Margaret had looked at David then, really looked at him. I tried to warn you. Remember 9 months ago? Dinner at Per Se? You thought I was asking you to choose between your mother and my career. But that's not what I was doing at all. David's face had gone white. You were trying to tell me about the fraud. I was trying to give you a chance to do the right thing. Instead, you filed for divorce 3 weeks later. Margaret's voice had remained calm, but there had been steel underneath. I can only assume Eleanor convinced you I was becoming a liability, that I knew too much, that it was safer to get rid of me. Patricia's phone had rung again. She'd answered it, listened, and her face had gone from pale to almost green. The FBI just arrived at Whitmore and Associates. They're seizing records and computers. There are agents in the building right now. This is blackmail, Eleanor had said, but her voice had lacked conviction. This is extortion. You can't. I haven't asked you for anything, Margaret had interrupted. The evidence was submitted to the SEC, the IRS, and the Manhattan District Attorney's Office 48 hours ago. The investigation was already underway before I walked into this room. This isn't blackmail, Eleanor. These are consequences. David had finally found his voice. Margaret, please. We can fix this. I'll cooperate with the investigation. I'll testify against her. I'll do whatever. You knew, Margaret had said softly. Maybe not at first, but you've known for at least 2 years. I saw the emails, David. The ones where you helped Eleanor set up the shell companies. The ones where you signed off on fraudulent expense reports. You weren't just complicit. You were an active participant. I was trying to save the company by breaking the law, by stealing from the IRS, by committing federal crimes. Margaret had shaken her head. You had so many chances to be better than this, to be the man I thought I married. But you chose her instead. Eleanor had moved toward Margaret then, and for a moment, Margaret had thought the older woman might actually attack her. You vindictive little. Careful, Margaret had warned, because we're not finished yet. She'd pulled out a folder from her bag, the only thing she'd brought with her besides her phone, and slid it across the conference table. It had landed right in front of Patricia. That's a patent application, Margaret had said. Filed 7 years ago, 6 months before I married David. For a proprietary investment analysis and prediction algorithm. I developed it as my thesis project at Columbia. Does that sound familiar? David had opened the folder with shaking hands, his face growing paler with each page he turned. But you said, you told us you developed this for the firm. I said I implemented it for the firm, Margaret had corrected, her voice sharp. I never said I created it specifically for you. I'd been working on that algorithm since my senior year of grad school. I own it, David. I've always owned it. Patricia had grabbed the folder, speed reading through the documents. This can't be right. The patent office would have. The patent was granted 5 years ago, Margaret had said calmly. I just never told you about it. Why would I? You were my husband's family. I trusted you. I let you use my intellectual property for free because I thought we were building something together. You can't just take it back, Eleanor had said. But there had been panic in her voice now. The company depends on that algorithm. Our entire investment strategy is built on something I own, Margaret had finished. And as of 48 hours ago, I've licensed it exclusively to 3 of your biggest competitors. Blackstone Capital, Vanguard Strategic Investments, and Morrison and Associates. $6 million per year per company. That's $18 million annually in licensing fees that I'll be collecting. The room had gone so quiet Margaret could hear the air conditioning humming. You'll need to license it from me too, of course, Margaret had continued. If you want to continue using it, the annual fee for Whitmore and Associates will be, let's say $12 million. I'm charging you more because, well, you stole it. Consider it a theft tax. We can't afford that, David had whispered. Not with the investigation. Not with the accounts frozen. Then I guess you'll need to rebuild your entire investment strategy from scratch, Margaret had said. Good luck with that. I hear it takes years to develop a working algorithm. You might want to get started. Eleanor had sunk into her chair, and for the first time since Margaret had known her, the woman had looked old, defeated. Why? She'd asked quietly. Why go to such lengths? You could have just taken the settlement and disappeared. Because you called me discarded? Margaret had said, and her voice had finally shown emotion. Because you spent 7 years making me feel worthless. Because you took credit for my work and then tried to erase me from your history. Because you taught your son that people like me are disposable. She'd looked at David one more time. I loved you. I really did. I would have spent the rest of my life building something extraordinary with you. But you chose to be her puppet instead of my partner. Margaret had picked up her bag and headed for the door again. This time, no one tried to stop her. Oh, she'd said, pausing at the doorframe. One more thing. Vanessa Ashford? Senator Ashford's daughter? The one you've been setting up with David. Eleanor had looked up, and Margaret had seen the final blow coming before Eleanor even understood it. Senator Ashford is being questioned by federal investigators as we speak. About illegal campaign contributions. Contributions that came from your shell companies, Eleanor. Contributions that I also documented and reported to the Federal Election Commission. He'll probably resign before the end of the week. I doubt his daughter will want anything to do with the Whitmore name after that. Patricia had made a strangled sound. You're destroying them. You're destroying everything. No, Margaret had said calmly. They destroyed themselves. I just made sure there were consequences. She'd walked out then, through the reception area with its expensive furniture and contemptuous staff, down the elevator 40 floors, out onto Fifth Avenue into the autumn sunshine. Her phone had started buzzing immediately. A text from Daniel. FBI confirmed. They're making arrests. You did it. Another from Rebecca Torres at the DA's office. Indictments being prepared. Thank you for your courage. A third from Jonathan Fitzgerald. Emergency board vote complete. Eleanor and David removed from all positions. Company will cooperate fully with investigation. Margaret had stood on the corner of 5th Avenue and 42nd Street, letting the New York crowd flow around her. Yellow cabs honked. Tourists took photos. Street vendors called out their wares. The city kept moving, utterly indifferent to the small drama that had just played out 40 floors above. She'd thought about her mother then, about the woman who'd cleaned toilets and scrubbed floors so Margaret could go to college. The woman who'd never complained, never given up, never let anyone make her feel less than human despite doing work that society deemed inferior. I hope you're proud of me, Mom, Margaret had whispered to the sky. Her phone had rung. A 415 area code, San Francisco. Margaret Hayes, she'd answered. Ms. Hayes, this is Richard Chun from Titan Ventures. We're a venture capital firm based in Silicon Valley, and we've been following your work very closely. We're impressed with Hayes' digital solutions, particularly your proprietary investment algorithm. We'd like to discuss a significant investment opportunity. Margaret's heart had skipped a beat. I'm listening. We're prepared to offer $50 million for a 20% equity stake in your company. That would value Hayes Digital at $250 million, considerably more than the $2 million your soon-to-be ex-husband's lawyers estimated. We've done our due diligence, Ms. Hayes. We know what you're really worth. Margaret had smiled. Really smiled. When would you like to meet? How about next Tuesday? We'll fly you out first class, of course. Put you up at the Four Seasons. Give you the full presentation on what we can do together. Tuesday works perfectly, Margaret had said. Send the details to my office. Excellent. Oh, and Ms. Hayes, one more thing. We were wondering if you'd be interested in joining our board of advisors. We invest in a lot of fintech companies, and your expertise in algorithm development would be invaluable. The position comes with stock options and a 6-figure annual retainer. Margaret had looked up at the sky, at the buildings reaching toward heaven, at the city that had tried to break her and failed. I'm very interested. Let's discuss details on Tuesday. She'd hung up and started walking. Not back to her studio in Brooklyn. Not back to her old life. Forward. Always forward. 3 days later. The headlines had been everywhere. Whitmore investment scandal. Mother and son face federal charges. Tech entrepreneur's algorithm brings down old money dynasty. The divorce that exposed a criminal empire. Margaret had been sitting in a coffee shop in Brooklyn. finally allowing herself to process everything that had happened. When Daniel had called. "Have you seen the news?" he'd asked. "I've seen it. Margaret, you need to be careful. The media is going to come after you hard. They're going to want interviews, they're going to dig into your past, they're going to—" "Let them," Margaret had said calmly. "I have nothing to hide. Unlike some people. There's something else." Daniel had paused. David's attorney called. "He wants to meet. Says David wants to talk to you." "No. Margaret, I think you should consider it. He might have information that could help the investigation. The DA would appreciate." "I don't care what the DA would appreciate," Margaret had said. "I'm done with David. Done with that family. Done with all of it." "Fair enough." Daniel had sighed. "For what it's worth, you did the right thing. A lot of people in your position would have just taken the money and run." "My mother didn't raise me to run," Margaret had said. "She raised me to fight." After she'd hung up, Margaret had sat in that coffee shop for a long time, watching people come and go. Young professionals grabbing their morning lattes. Students with laptops working on papers. Mothers with strollers meeting friends. Normal people living normal lives, completely unaware that 48 hours ago, Margaret had taken down one of New York's oldest families. Her phone had buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Ms. Hayes, this is Jessica Wu from the Wall Street Journal. I'd love to interview you about your role in the Whitmore scandal. Would you be willing to?" Margaret had deleted it without reading the rest. Another text, this one from Sarah Johnson, a CEO Margaret had met once at a tech conference. "Saw the news. You're a hero. Let's have dinner next week. I want to introduce you to some people who can help you take your company to the next level." Margaret had smiled and saved that number. The rest of the week had been a blur. The Titan Ventures investment had closed faster than Margaret had thought possible. Apparently, Silicon Valley moved quickly when they smelled blood in the water from old money. Hayes Digital Solutions had gone from a struggling 5-person consulting firm to a 40-person powerhouse practically overnight. Margaret had hired a PR firm to manage the media requests. She'd given exactly one interview, to Bloomberg, and had kept it strictly professional. "I discovered evidence of financial crimes and felt obligated to report them to the authorities. The divorce is a separate, private matter." She hadn't mentioned the 7 years of emotional abuse. Hadn't mentioned Eleanor's cruelty or David's weakness. Hadn't mentioned any of it. Let them wonder. Let them speculate. Margaret had said everything she needed to say in that conference room. 2 weeks later, the indictments had come down on a Friday afternoon. Eleanor Whitmore, 15 counts including tax evasion, wire fraud, and money laundering, facing up to 20 years in federal prison. David Whitmore, 8 counts of conspiracy and fraud, facing up to 10 years. Senator Ashford had resigned, just as Margaret had predicted. His daughter Vanessa had released a statement through her attorney saying she'd had no knowledge of any financial improprieties, and was shocked and dismayed by these allegations. Whitmore and Associates had been dissolved, its assets seized by the government. The clients had fled to other firms, including the 3 firms now using Margaret's algorithm under license. Margaret had been in her new office, a beautiful space in a converted warehouse in Dumbo with views of the Manhattan Bridge, when her assistant had knocked. "Ms. Hayes, there's someone here to see you. He doesn't have an appointment." The assistant had paused. "It's David Whitmore." Margaret had looked up from the contract she'd been reviewing. She'd known this moment would come eventually. "Give me 5 minutes. Then send him in." She'd used those 5 minutes to center herself, to remember who she was now versus who she'd been when she'd signed those divorce papers, to prepare for whatever David was going to say. When David had walked in, Margaret had barely recognized him. He'd lost weight. His suit was rumpled. The confidence and privilege that had always surrounded him like an aura were gone, replaced by something that looked almost like humility. "Thank you for seeing me," he'd said quietly. "You have 10 minutes, Margaret had replied. Not unkindly but not warmly either. "I have a board meeting after this." David had sat down heavily in the chair across from her desk. For a long moment, he just looked at her, and Margaret had seen something in his eyes she'd never seen before. Genuine remorse. "I came to apologize," he'd said finally. "For everything. You were right about all of it. I was weak. I let my mother control me. I destroyed the best thing in my life because I was too much of a coward to stand up to her." "Yes," Margaret had said simply. "You did. The lawyers say I'm looking at 5 to 7 years if I take the plea deal. Mother might get 15. The firm is gone. Our reputation is destroyed. Everything we built, everything you built for us is gone." He'd looked down at his hands. "I deserve all of it." Margaret had studied him carefully. Part of her, a small part, still remembered the boy she'd fallen in love with at Columbia. The one who'd brought her coffee in the library. The one who'd told her she was going to change the world. But that boy had been gone for a long time. Maybe he'd never really existed at all. "Why did you really come here, David?" she'd asked. "You didn't come just to apologize." He'd looked up at her, and she'd seen tears in his eyes. "I came to ask you something. The prosecutors want me to testify against my mother. They're saying it could reduce my sentence significantly. Maybe even get me down to 2 or 3 years. And I can't decide if I should do it. She's my mother, Margaret. She's horrible and manipulative, and she destroyed both of our lives. But she's still my mother." His voice had broken. "What would you do?" Margaret had sat back in her chair, considering the question. 6 months ago, she would have told him to throw Eleanor to the wolves without hesitation. 6 months ago, she would have wanted maximum damage, maximum pain. But now she just felt tired. "I think," she'd said slowly, "that you need to stop asking other people what you should do and figure it out for yourself. That's been your problem all along, David. You've spent your entire life letting other people make your decisions. First your mother, then me, now the prosecutors. When are you going to decide who you want to be?" David had wiped his eyes. "I don't know how." "Then prison might be good for you," Margaret had said, and she'd meant it. "Maybe you'll figure it out when you don't have anyone else to rely on." He'd nodded slowly and stood to leave. At the door, he'd paused. "For what it's worth, I always knew you'd be extraordinary. I just didn't realize you'd be extraordinary despite me instead of because of me. That was arrogant of me." "Yes," Margaret had agreed. "It was." After he'd left, Margaret had sat at her desk for a long time, looking out at the Manhattan Bridge. The afternoon sun had been painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, and the city had looked almost beautiful. Her phone had buzzed with a text from Sarah Johnson. "Dinner tonight at 11 Madison Park? Want you to meet the CEO of Apex Financial. They're looking for new board members and your name came up." Margaret had smiled and typed back, "I'll be there." Another text had come through, this one from Rebecca Torres at the DA's office. "Final hearing is set for next month. Your testimony won't be needed, we have enough evidence. Thank you again for everything you did." Margaret had put her phone down and turned back to her computer. She'd had work to do, contracts to review, employees to manage, a company to build. The revenge was complete. The justice had been served. Eleanor and David would face the consequences of their actions. But Margaret wasn't thinking about them anymore. She was thinking about the future. If you enjoyed Margaret's story of triumph, please hit that like button and subscribe for more dramatic stories with unexpected twists. Drop a comment below and let me know. What was your favorite moment from this story? And where are you watching from? I love hearing from you all. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.